Gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Combat Veteran Breakdown. I am your host, Paul, and today I, as you probably know, made a little bit of a clickbait title. Maybe I'm doing a little bit of trolling, but the best trolling is always based on something you sincerely believe, just framed in a way that gets people riled up. Do I think America needs a draft? No, sorry. But what I think America does actually need or would benefit from, and I know we'll never do, but is in fact a mandatory national service. And I would go so far as to say lots of countries in the developed world have mandatory national service, and guess what? They do just fine. In fact, countries like Germany up until I think the 80s had mandatory national service. Israel has a mandatory national service. Switzerland, I believe Sweden also has mandatory national service. South Korea has a robust mandatory national service. I think it's like 3 years or something. But the point I'm trying to make is this isn't actually the bananas idea that you think it is. Now, why do I think that America, who has a robust army and a robust Department of Defense, could stand to use a little bit of national service requirements? Well, first off, I don't think that everyone should have to put on a uniform and serve in the military. The military is not for some people, and a functioning society is a rich tapestry with a lot of different people in it, and some of those people just aren't conducive to military service. Some of them do not have the character or fortitude for it. Some people have conditions that would totally preclude them from it. Some people are just personality-wise just woefully unsuited. But what I do think the country needs is a national service requirement, a requirement that you must spend some period of time, 6 months or a year, in the service of your country. So I'm going to lay out the case for it, and you guys can roast me in the comments. First off, obviously, the number one thing, not the number one thing, I think they're all equally important. But my vision would be that national service happens either when you turn 18 or the year after you graduate college, right? And that year, you would obviously, like the military, right, have to show up. You'd be paid. You'd receive benefits. They could, for example, put you basically on, like, have an exception that says, okay, you get Medicaid, right, while you're working in this national service capacity, and you're paid like a U.S. Army private, and you get maybe a meal stipend and assigned housing, right, the same way the military works it all out. But what I would also say is that it gives the participants a chance to be exposed to how the world works. And now, the military did not teach me how the world works entirely, but it did show me a lot of things. How do we solve a problem on a military size level? That's actually a good question that if you're a cog in that machine, you have no choice but to wrestle with. You can watch the military say, hey, we want to have a new uniform requirement. And you watch as, hey, you realize the constraints and struggles that entails. You say, wow, you can't just impose the requirement because when you go to the PX, it's all sold out. And you say, okay, well, maybe you need to phase it in. And you phase it in, and you still realize that there's some people who forgot about it, and, or anything else the military does. You want to drive a convoy from one base to another. You realize that it takes planning and fuel. It takes a whole team working together. You have to work backwards from the problem. And I think even if you're like at the private level, you still have to see those things in the military. You still have to see how big organizations move and navigate the world. And the truth is, if you don't understand that in today's day and age, if you don't understand how a major hierarchical corporation or a government or a military or even things like your state and county, if you can't think about how they might work, then you aren't informed enough as a citizen to be a good voter. I mean, how often do you see some idiot on Twitter whose only qualification is living off a pension fund and tweeting and occasionally writing a hot take, weigh in on what they think would be the way to run the country. And it's like, this dude or woman, this person probably isn't even qualified to run their own life, let alone a country. So just exposing everyone to a baseline level of hey, this is how things get done in the real world. And that's why I think it shouldn't necessarily be a national military service, right? How fascinating would it be to just be like, hey, in this rural part of the country, you guys are going to help create 10 miles of paved road. You're going to be a paving crew. And just to watch and say, okay, what does it take just to pave a road? You know? And you might encounter like, oh, how much does this cost? How much does it take? What sort of things delay the operation? Oh, waiting for parts on the machine, waiting for the asphalt delivery. You just realize that what feel like really simple solutions, if you live inside a bubble, can actually be really complicated. And you only really learn that, I think, if you get out and you watch sort of the chaos happen. And so I think a mandatory national service will definitely help people do that. The other more classic case for it is, of course, national identity. And I actually think this is a pretty tremendous problem. A lot of people talk about the polarization in the United States, and I think that's actually a extremely serious problem, because if we can't solve that, then we can't tackle the other problems, right? And the thing that's happening in polarization that I think worries me more than anything else is that on the edges, people are getting pushed off this cliff where they, on either end, say that they either hate America, they hate the country they live in, they feel like they're not part of it. And this is true on both sides. There's no one side that has a monopoly on loving their country, on patriotism. You know, you can look at people on the far left who are like, America's a racist country, America with a K, bro. You know, and people on the right who are just like, corrupt, election stealing, not my president. You're just like, dude, this isn't how this works. This is your country. And like, if you hate it so much, like, you can leave, and you should. But a lot of people, I think, emotionally, right? I'm a believer that you have to emotionally internalize something before it becomes like a rationalized ideology. Does that make sense? It's like you're never going to come to a significant conclusion unless emotionally the groundwork has already been laid. And for most people, because they only encounter their country in the larger sense, right? Their government and the larger population that lives in it, they only encounter them in basically bad situations, right? When it's either like a tremendous crowd, some sort of crisis, or when they get pulled over by a cop, or when they have to wait at the DMV, or of course, when they pay their taxes. All of which just make you go, man, this country doesn't do jack. And I understand that feeling, but the statistics are that, yeah, it's really annoying how much we have to pay in taxes. But look at what we get. Yeah, we have a huge defense budget as a total number. As a percentage of our GDP, it's slightly larger than other countries, but not by a ton. But we also pay for a tremendous amount of money for Social Security, a program that supports the old and infirm, right? Older and Americans who are unable to work. Or, you know, too old, too sick, whatever. It also supports Medicare and Medicaid, providing health care to people that would otherwise never have access to it. And, right, those are great programs. But if you never encounter actually what they do, you're just going to feel like the government takes your money and gives you a middle finger. And if that happens enough, of course, you're going to come to this conclusion emotionally that you don't need the government, right? Like every libertarian hot take who's like, all right, if you really don't think you need the government, bro, I know a bunch of lawless countries where you can visit, and let me know how that goes. So establishing this sense of people that, hey, this country actually is something that is doing things that are important, right? Whether that's, again, being a caretaker in a nursing home for Medicare patients, for being a paving crew in a rural area, serving obviously in the military, even the Coast Guard, working anywhere, right? In a charity that helps migrants, assisting the Border Patrol. There's so many things that are organizations that are a part of how this country functions. And if more people got out and actually did stuff that's a part of it, they might actually feel like the country isn't just some annoying politicians who talk out their ass on TV. They might actually feel like this country is larger than that, and the people that work hard every day and make it run are worth supporting and worth, standing up for. I think the really important stuff is what we're getting to, right? Working with other people. I think this is probably the number one thing, because I worry a lot about the way society is currently structured. And in the United States, for I'm going to say a lot of people, right? We spend very little time around others. For most of human history, you would spend 12 to 14 hours a day around groups of other people, whether you were a farmer or in medieval Europe, or you're a caveman, or you're a farmer in the Civil War. Most people are farmers, guys, in human history. That you spend a lot of time around other people. And only recently, only in the past couple of years, has being around other people and interacting with them and understanding them as on a human level, understanding who they really are as people, that has only recently become not the norm. Look at me. I'm a full-time content creator now. I know, right? It's weird to me too. But it means that I was thinking about it on a typical day, because my wife also works from home. I have this skew where I spend probably 16 hours a day awake within probably 40 feet of my wife at any given moment. And I, on a typical day, talk to 0 other people, which is really, that can't be good for a person's psychology. And I have the advantage of being married. I can't imagine my psychological state if I was totally decoupled from interacting with any other person in the flesh in any meaningful way. And so I think just being like, hey, you have to talk to another person. You can't learn about what other people are like through Twitter, through Facebook, through YouTube rabbit holes. Like, that's not really what people are like. You can't learn about it through the news, right? People are complicated and they're nuanced, and they're even people who adopt beliefs that you find pretty weird. You could still find their humanity in most cases. I think there's some beliefs that like cut to the core of who you are, and they're pretty bad. But most of the time, those beliefs are there's way fewer of those than you may realize. But you only are going to come to that realization if you just spend time around people. And I think a national service, right? My national service requirement ideal would be that you have to be around a really different group of people than you. The military does a great job of this. And at the end of the day, I would say most of the soldiers that I led had, up into joining the military, led lives that were really, really different from my own. And that is pretty tremendous, to humanize people from the worst parts of the worst cities of America to people who were drug dealers who joined the military because they felt like they were going to get arrested soon, to rich college kids who dropped out because they got busted with pot one too many times. The fact that you have to not only meet them all, but work with them to get things together and make stuff happen is a huge skill set, and it colors the way you view everything else in the world. And it's a fundamental skill to have. Basically, no matter what you do with the rest of your life, an intrinsic understanding of the rest of the country that you have to work with, right? In order to be a good citizen, right, you have to work with other Americans. You and them have to vote together on who gets to run the country. You and them have to drive on the same roads. You and them have to follow the same laws, and you have to live in the same spaces. There's a core sense of cooperation that we have here, and maybe it's just me, but you can let me know in the comments if you've noticed this too. The rate of cooperation feels like it's been dropping, sometimes like pretty precipitously. The rate at which people will give each other the finger or drive really aggressively, the rate at which people will confront each other in stores for doing things the other one doesn't like, it's pretty disheartening. And I think it's a function of the fact that you've never really gotten a chance to interact with people who are different than you. You've only been programmed how to see them by what you read from your particular social media or news sources. And as a result, you don't treat them like human beings because you don't see them like human beings. You see them as embodied versions of Twitter parodies, right? Of what Twitter or YouTube or whatever tells you they are. And I think it's the most dangerous trend for our country, actually. It is, And so I think just learning to work with others would be a tremendous, tremendous skill set. The other thing is sort of what we talked about. It's becoming emotionally invested in the country. Do you ever notice how sometimes even if you get forced to do something, let's say at work, right? You're forced to build something that you know is kind of a waste of time. And you waste all this time and you do it and it's done. And then you feel a little proud of it. You're like, we really pulled that off, right? Even if it's just like you shoveled a pile of dirt. You're like, man, that pile of dirt used to be big. And now this place is clear and open, right? There's a level of satisfaction because you become emotionally invested in the work that you do, pretty much no matter what it is. And so I think that if you invest in making the country better, it's going to change your outlook in a fundamental way. I think a lot of people in this country, right, go up and they ask, what can I get out of it? How can I dodge as many taxes as possible? How can I navigate through life getting and taking as much as I can and giving as little as possible? Because, giving your time and energy to someone else is for suckers, right? And it's every person for themselves. And that's a really sad, toxic mentality that, again, a lot of people have. This selfish, me first, I need to get mine, nobody else deserves help type of mentality is really sad. And it's not, you can't run a country when everyone has that mentality. And so I think making a service in which you have to do the thing, right? And later on, you'll adopt the belief. You have to do the thing where you make the country better. And then you'll find that people will have this belief that the country, like that they are someone who's invested in the success of the country because they have invested a year of their lives in the success of the country. And I know the feeling of when you invest your time in the country in some sort of big time-wasting effort, and like the war in Afghanistan, but I still have a sense that as long as I'm here in the country, I still have an obligation to make it better. Maybe not at the same scale as a war, but hopefully in even the smaller scales right in my own community. And I think this sort of leads to my last point, and that is that ultimately you're going to get people to do something good and to understand what doing good constitutes. That it's not dramatic, it's not making a heart-forming Instagram post. You'll actually get to see, you won't even necessarily get a thank you. Right? If you just serve soup in a soup kitchen, a lot of people will not only not thank you, but they'll complain about the quality of the soup. But you know what? That's still doing a good thing. And I think it's important for people to recognize that it's like doing a good thing it's not what you see on social media. It's what you do every day, quietly, thanklessly. And sometimes those people do those things behind the scenes. and they get to feel good about doing good, but it's not something that you can put on Instagram or put on a resume. Sometimes it's just dirty, crappy, boring work, and you're just a cog in a machine. But if the machine helps people, then you're still doing a good thing. And I think it's important for people to understand that, to know that, like, out there in the world, right, there's people that do thankless jobs for the benefit of all of us, and that they deserve some credit. I think when you look at the U.S. history generally, there's a real sense that some of the biggest accomplishments the country ever had took place after periods in which there was broad national service among men. I get it, right? But I think that's really significant. I think about the U.S. economic boom in the post-war era, up all the way really to the moon landing. And it's reflective, I think, of the fact that people developed a sense that their country could do a lot more when everyone pulled together. I mean, you got to think of how insane the idea is of a moon landing. 70 years ago, America was like, we're going to land on the moon. And here we are, nearly 100 years later, and not one other country has done it, right? They were able to take the computer, right? I mean, look, my cell phone is more powerful than the computer that took the astronauts to the moon, right? Everything is more efficient, hundreds of times more efficient than it was 70 years ago. And yet, the European Union can't put somebody on the moon. The Russian Federation cannot put someone on the moon. China would love to put someone on the moon. And yet, none of those things have happened. And it's a testament to the fact that when Americans really wanted to, right, they all were able to band together and do their part, right? And sometimes that part was just paying your taxes. But they pulled it off, right? And that's pretty impressive, you know, paying your taxes. And they all voted for politicians that, you know, would ensure that the moon landing, the space program would continue. Right? They could have voted for cut the budget politicians who were like, we don't need this big government. Like, we don't want this rocket. It's expensive. What's it for? And it's like, look, man, it's the Americans' like national, the only non-war national pride at this point that America still gets to claim as being the only one. And it happened in an era when, think about it, the preceding 1969, when we landed on the moon, you had a draft for Vietnam, you had a draft for Korea, you had a draft for World War II, you probably even had a World War I draftees that were still alive and voting. And all of that created this mentality of, hey, the government can do more. Even I bet you had a lot of public works and conservation corps veterans, right? Remember from the 1930s, the FDR created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was basically a paramilitary jobs program that did exactly what I'm talking about. And all this to say that if you get people who make these investments and develop this sense that they should be proud of their country, that it can do a lot of things if they work together, it can achieve unbelievable things if they work together. And I think we've just sort of lost that mentality. We're like, we can't really do anything. We can't change anything. Everything is going to go the way it goes, and your best bet is to just take as much and hoard as much you can for yourself. And it's really sad, and trust me, a lot of the country's leadership took advantage of that trust that people placed in them to screw people. And I think that's unfortunate. Like, the leadership of this country definitely deserves... Like, people are not remiss to approach it with cynicism, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think this general national service, a return to national service, let's be honest, would be a good way to make people invest in the country again, but also understand what it can expect out of it. Because that's the other thing. The moon landing is one example, but the civil rights took place at the exact same era because there was a sense that you could do it. If collective action could actually make some pretty tremendous changes in the way the country worked. And look, I mean, when's the last time there was a broad popular movement that actually resulted in the reforms they were advocating? Yeah, there's been a lot of protests about things, but guess what? The protests haven't stopped anything. I'm sorry, but it bums me out too. There were the largest anti-war protest in the history of the world was against the Iraq War, and that thing went on for 15 years, right? Look, has there been a national police reform bill? No, there were nationwide protests about it. That's the thing. There's something missing. There's some sort of collective glue that is missing with people. And maybe it's social media redirecting people's attentions. They don't have the attention span. But I think some of it is the glue is like you have to be on the ground and have these national identities and develop this sense that the work is done not on Instagram. The hard work isn't Instagrammable to making change. And maybe people understood that better in the 60s. I don't know. But what I do know is that right now, I think the country as it is so fragmented and there's so much bitterness that you have to do something to force people to work with the people they don't like in support of and to make the country better. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. If you're listening on anything really, if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications. If you're on Spotify, hit that follow button and try to give me a rate. If you can rate it 5 stars, that'd be cool. But you can also rate it 1 star and just make a mean comment. But don't. The Spotify will bump it if you give me 5 stars. So do that. If it's on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. And other than that, guys, thanks for joining me. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.